The elevator didn't go up, it went down. It plunged past the marble lobby of the Vale, a relic of 19th century New York, all Gothic arches and gas lamps converted to electric, and kept falling, past the sub-basements, past the wine cellars, past the city's bedrock. It fell into a place that didn't exist, a sterile, pressurized silence that felt miles beneath the 2002 city night. The doors hissed open, not onto velvet carpet, but onto sterile, fluorescent white. Dr. Lena Arden ran, her sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. The air was wrong. It was cold, sterile, and thick with the smell of ozone and burnt silver. Above her, the old hotel's 19th century foundation, massive, weeping stones, were visible, framing the modern steel and glass of the containment lab. A red light pulsed on the bulkhead door, staining the corridor in rhythmic waves of crisis. "It's a level 5, doctor," a tech shouted, his face pale behind a safety visor. "The asset is compromised." "Compromised how?" Lena demanded, jamming her keycard into the panel. The door hissed, recognizing her clearance. "The suppression grid failed. He took the silver charge directly. We have total flatline." The door slid open. The lab was chaos. $1 million of equipment was shattered. Consoles sparked, raining orange embers onto the floor. But the room itself was silent. The frantic, screaming beep of the heart monitor was gone, replaced by a single, deafening, continuous tone. Flatline. In the center of the room, strapped to a reinforced steel gurney, was the man, the asset, patient zero. He was the calm at the eye of the storm. Lena moved, her trauma nurse instincts cutting through the panic. She'd been contracted by Vale Biotech to treat an experimental patient, but this was no experiment. This was an execution. He wasn't in a gown. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit of deep violet, the kind of aristocratic cut she'd only seen in paintings. The fabric was charred across his chest and left arm, burned through by a web of silver restraints that now lay broken on the floor. His skin was marble. His hair, splayed against the steel headrest, was a stark silver white. His face was all sharp angles and sculpted beauty, an ageless, powerful stillness that terrified her more than the alarms. He was dead. She pressed her fingers to the cold column of his carotid artery. Nothing. The skin was absolute zero, a profound mineral cold that had nothing to do with life. No pulse, no breath. She reached for the paddles, her hands steady, but she knew it was pointless. You couldn't shock a body this cold. Her fingers brushed the edge of the silver-burned fabric on his chest. A spark, blue, hard and hot, jumped from her skin to his. It wasn't static. It was a jolt, a bioelectric shock that snapped up her arm and made her own heart leap against her ribs. The effect was instantaneous. The screaming flatline tone stopped. The sparking consoles died. The pulsing red emergency lights went black. The lab was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness, broken only by the faint green emergency exit signs. Silence. The only sound was the frantic, sudden thunder of Lena's own heart in her ears. "Lights," she whispered, fumbling, blind. "Someone get the lights." A sound cut through the black. Thump. It was low, resonant, and impossibly heavy. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't machinery. Thump. Lena froze. Her blood turned to ice. It was a heartbeat. A soft red glow flickered in the center of the room. It wasn't a light. It was eyes. They were open. They were pale, metallic gray, but lit from within by a faint, pulsing crimson, like the embers of a fire banked for a century. They were staring directly at her. He didn't gasp. He didn't move. He simply watched. The air crackled. The smell of ozone intensified, mixing with something else, something ancient and hungry. His lips parted. A soft breath, the first one he'd taken since she arrived, ghosted into the cold air. He whispered her name, Lena. It wasn't a question. It was a sound of recognition, spoken in a quiet, aristocratic voice that held no pain, no confusion. It was the calmest sound in the room, and the most terrifying. They had never met. His file was a black hole of redactions. She didn't even know his name. Before she could answer, before she could even process the impossible sound of that single heartbeat, the main lab doors behind her exploded inward. "Breach! Breach!" Containment protocol! Blinding white light flooded the room. Tactical teams stormed in, armor-clad, weapons raised, the beams of their rifles centering on the man on the table. Dr. Arden, step away from the asset. Now! Don't shoot! Lena yelled, throwing a hand up, her eyes blinded by the strobing lights. He's alive. The main power grid suddenly kicked back on, flooding the lab in harsh, sterile fluorescence. The tactical team froze. In the sudden, sterile light, he looked even more impossible. The silver burns on his chest smoked. The red glow in his eyes was gone, leaving only that piercing, silver gray. But they were still fixed on her, unblinking, ignoring the guns, ignoring the soldiers, seeing only her. The system reboot must have triggered another fault. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickered, and died. Total darkness returned. Lena heard the men shouting, the click-clack of weapons being armed. The air was electric. And then, his voice. It was no longer a whisper. It was a low, resonant statement that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor, into her bones. It was impossibly close, a breath against her ear in the total black. You touched what I swore I'd never love again. The main lights snapped back on, humming with a painful, sterile brightness. The tactical team flinched, their weapons still aimed at the man on the gurney. But the man was no longer lying down. He was sitting up. His movement had been invisible, faster than the flicker of the lights. The heavy restraints were still buckled, but he was sitting, his back straight, his bare feet planted on the cold floor. The silver-white hair was immaculate, and his deep violet suit, though burned, was still aristocratic. He wasn't looking at the soldiers. He was looking only at Lena. "Stand down, Captain!" A new voice, sharp and human, cut through the tension. A man in an immaculate black suit, Mr. Kincaid, the head of Vale's board, strode into the room. He looked at the armed men with disgust. "This is a medical ward, not a firing range. Get your men out." "Sir, the asset is active. The founder is awake," Kincaid corrected, his voice dropping. "And you are dismissed." The captain stared, his face a mask of confusion and fear, but the order was absolute. The soldiers lowered their weapons and backed out of the lab, their boots crunching on the broken glass. Kincaid turned to Lena. His face was pale, but his smile was tight. "Dr. Arden, your contract has been amended. You are no longer a consultant." "What am I?" Lena asked, her voice shaking. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "You're his physician, exclusively." Kincaid slid a black data slate across a remaining intact console. "New NDA. The penalties for a breach are severe. You will not leave the Vale. You will not contact the outside world. You will be moved to his private ward, effective immediately." "His ward? What is he?" Kincaid looked at the man on the gurney. The man, Severin, hadn't moved. He just watched Lena, his silver-gray eyes holding an unnerving, ancient calm. "He is patient zero," Kincaid said quietly. "And you, doctor, are apparently the only medicine that works." The private ward wasn't a hospital room. It was the penthouse. The same elevator that had taken her to the sterile depths now lifted her to the sky. The doors opened onto a vast, silent space of dark wood, black velvet, and glass. Rain lashed against floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering 2002 New York skyline. It was a king's apartment, gothic and modern, furnished with a precision that felt cold, empty. And in the corner, where a grand piano should have been, was a full ICU setup, monitors, IV stands, and diagnostic equipment, all seamlessly integrated. Severin was there, standing by the window, his back to her. He was dressed in a fresh black silk shirt and dark trousers. He looked like the CEO of the company, not the specimen trapped beneath it. Lena was left alone with him. The heavy doors clicked shut, the sound of the lock engaging absolute. She was a prisoner. "You're him," she said, her voice small in the cavernous room. "Vale, Severin Vale, the founder. You're supposed to be a recluse, not... "Dead?" he offered. His voice was smooth, a low vibration that seemed to soak up the room's silence. He turned. His face was perfect, sculpted, and pale, but the silver burns were still there, angry, raw wounds that marred the skin of his left hand and crept up his neck from the collar of his new shirt. They weren't healing. "My NDA says I'm your doctor," Lena said, grabbing the medical kit, forcing herself into the familiar routine. "So let me be your doctor. Sit down. I need to check your vitals." "My vitals are irrelevant. Not to me." She walked toward him, her hands miraculously steady. She lifted the thermometer. "Please." He watched her, his stillness a physical weight. He didn't blink, but he sat on the edge of the examination table. She took his temperature. The digital thermometer whirred for a moment, then flashed, "Error, temp low." She grabbed a wide-range analog thermometer from the kit. She held it under his tongue, her fingers brushing his cold lips. After a minute, she read it. The mercury hadn't risen past 72.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 22.4 degrees Celsius. The temperature of the room, not a living being. Profoundly, impossibly cold. She put the blood pressure cuff on his arm. The muscle was hard as stone. The cuff inflated, whirred, and then flashed an error. It couldn't find a pulse. She pressed her stethoscope to his chest, right over his heart. Thump. It was the same sound from the lab. A single, slow, impossibly powerful beat. It was so slow, she counted a full 10 seconds before the next one. Thump. It wasn't a human rhythm. It was the rhythm of something ancient, something that measured time in decades, not seconds. "This is impossible," she whispered, pulling the stethoscope away. "Your vitals, they defy logic." "I am a creature of logic, Dr. Arden. You are the one who defies it." His silver-gray eyes drifted to her hand. "You were cut in the lab." Lena looked down. A shard of glass from the chaos was embedded in her palm, a thin line of bright crimson blood welling up around it. She hadn't even felt it. "I need to—" She fumbled for a gauze pad. "Don't," he whispered. The command was soft but absolute. She pulled the glass from her own skin with a wince, and a single, perfect drop of her blood formed on her fingertip. She stared at it, red, warm, alive, everything he was not. He was still watching her hand, but his expression had changed. The aristocratic calm was gone, replaced by something else. A tension, a darkness. The faint red embers she'd seen in the lab returned to his eyes, a predatory glow. His lips parted slightly. "The burns," Lena said, her voice strained, trying to reclaim the moment. "The silver, they aren't healing." She reached out, her bloody finger extended, intending to point at the raw, festering burn on the back of his hand. Her fingertip, still wet with her own blood, brushed his skin. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The silver-charred flesh didn't just heal, it reversed. The skin sizzled, a faint wisp of smoke rising, and then, right before her eyes, the raw wound knitted itself shut. The dead flesh sloughed away and was replaced by new, perfect, marble-white skin. In the space of a heartbeat, the wound was gone, vanished. Lena stared, her breath catching in her throat. Severin looked at his healed hand, then back to her, his crimson-lit eyes wide with a terrifying, dawning realization. His hand was perfect. 1 second, it was a ruin of charred flesh and festering silver. Now, the skin was seamless, marble white and cold. Lena's blood, that single, insignificant drop, had undone an injury that all of Vale Biotech's resources could not. She tore her eyes from his healed hand and looked at his face. The realization was still there, but it wasn't wonder. It was horror. A profound, abyssal terror that chilled her more than his 72-degree skin. He moved. It wasn't a human motion. It was a blur, a whisper of displaced air. In the space between her blinks, he was no longer sitting on the exam table. He was across the vast penthouse, his back to her, his hands pressed flat against the rain-lashed glass. He was breathing. Lena could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the slow, unsteady rise and fall of his chest. He hadn't been breathing before. Not really. Not like this. Not with this ragged, desperate edge. "Get out." The voice wasn't his. The calm, aristocratic tone was gone, shattered. This was a rasp, a low, guttural snarl that vibrated with barely contained violence. I can't," Lena stammered, her words sounding thin and stupid in the opulent room. "I'm your doctor. I'm connected to your monitors. I have to document this." She pointed to the ICU setup, where the main diagnostic screen was still flashing pulse, error, and temp, low. "Document what?" He turned, and she stumbled back a step, her hand hitting the steel medical cart. Surgical tools rattled. The red glow in his eyes was no longer a faint ember. It was a wildfire. "That you just restarted something that hasn't worked in a century?" he hissed. "That you just woke up the only thing I ever learned to kill?" He was stalking toward her now, a predator in his own cage, and she was the one who had just rattled the lock. She was trapped between him and the wall of silent, dark monitors. The hunger," she whispered, the medical term useless for the reality in front of her. "The hunger is nothing." He stopped, just out of arm's reach. His gaze was locked on her hand, the one still smeared with a drying streak of crimson. "The hunger is a discipline. This is chaos. This is feeling. This is the human part, the part I cut out." He looked at the other burns, the raw, silver-charred wounds that still marred the side of his neck and disappeared under his black silk shirt. They were still there, festering. Lena could see the pain, a tight, white-knuckled grip on his control. He was in agony, and her blood was the only anesthetic. Her terror was absolute, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But the instinct of a healer is a sickness. It's a compulsion. She saw the wound, and she had the cure. "You're still hurt," she said, her voice shaking. "That is my penance, not your concern. But I can fix it." A sound that was almost a laugh, sharp and broken, escaped his lips. "Fix me? You have no idea what you're doing. You think you are healing me." He leaned in, and she was frozen, trapped by his proximity. The cold rolled off him, a tangible presence. "You, Dr. Arden, are igniting me." He raised his gaze from her hand to her eyes. The control was back, but it was brittle, a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. "Don't touch me again." The words hung in the air, an absolute and final command. This was the real NDA. This was the true law of this tower. Lena's heart was pounding, a frantic bird against her ribs. Run, hide, obey. But she didn't. She looked at the raw, sizzling burn on his neck. She looked at the agony he was trying to master. And she looked at the blood on her own hand. She was a scientist. She had to know. She was a doctor. She had to heal. And she was, in that single, fatal moment, something else entirely. Curious. Her hand moved. It didn't feel like her own. It felt like it was being pulled by an invisible string, a magnetic force that existed only between her pulse and his. "Lena," he whispered her name. And it was a plea, a warning. "Don't." She did. She raised her hand, her thumb still wet, and pressed it directly against the silver-charred wound on his neck. Chaos. It wasn't a gentle healing. It was an explosion. A jolt of pure, white-hot energy slammed through her, throwing her back against the wall. It wasn't an electric shock. It was life, a raw tidal wave of it, surging from her into him. He roared. It was a sound of agony and ecstasy. His back arched. His hands clenched into fists. The ICU equipment beside them went insane. Every alarm, every monitor shrieked at once. Lights flashed red and yellow, the telemetry scrolling into an unreadable blur of static. The blood pressure cuff, still on the table, inflated and exploded. The speakers crackled, filled with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming. And then, as one, every single monitor went black. The penthouse was plunged into a sudden, deafening silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and Lena's own ragged breathing. All the screens were dead, every one of them flashing the same single word: flatline. Lena stared at Severin. He was frozen, his head thrown back, his eyes squeezed shut. In the total electronic silence, she heard it. It was quiet. It was real. It was coming from his chest. Thump. The monitors were wrong. He hadn't flatlined. His heart had just beat. Once. Thump. The sound was real, physical. It shook the room, or maybe it just shook Lena. Severin gasped. It wasn't a breath. It was an agonizing, primal intake of air, the first he'd truly taken. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in a mix of agony and ecstasy, snapped open. The red glow was gone. They were just silver gray, but they were alive. They were human, and they were filled with a sudden, bottomless pain. "What?" he choked out, his hand flying to his neck where Lena's thumb was still pressed. "What did you do?" He was shaking. The man of marble and ice was visibly, violently shaking. The remaining silver burns on his chest and arms, the ones she hadn't touched, were sizzling, smoking, as his new beating heart pumped life into dead tissue. The silver was being burned out, rejected, purged, and it was excruciating. He collapsed, falling off the exam table to his knees. He was hollowed out, empty. This new life was a fire, and it needed fuel. Lena didn't have an answer. "The monitors are all flatlined." "They're not wrong," he hissed, clutching his stomach. "That heart, it's not supposed to beat. It's draining me. You're starving," she whispered, the medical realization hitting her. "Your body is healing. It's metabolizing. You need blood." His head snapped up. His eyes locked on her. It wasn't the calm, curious predator from before. This was a starving wolf. This was pure, agonizing, desperate need. Lena saw his fangs, true fangs, slide from his gums for the first time. She scrambled back, terror a cold spike in her throat. "No," he growled. He shoved himself away from her, crawling, dragging himself toward the penthouse door. "Not yours." He slammed his palm on the intercom. "Kincaid." His voice was a shredded, agonizing rasp. A second later, Kincaid's frantic voice came over the speaker. "Sir, we have total flatline. We thought, open the door." It wasn't a request. It was the command of a dying king. There was a heavy thunk as the magnetic locks on the penthouse door released. Severin looked back at Lena, his eyes blazing with that new, terrible hunger. "Stay here. Lock this door. Do not come out." He hauled himself to his feet, using the wall for support. He was a new living thing, unsteady on legs that were used to the precise, dead grace of immortality. He ripped the useless, smoking telemetry wires from his chest and stumbled out into the private elevator hall. The door slid shut, leaving Lena alone in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the penthouse, broken only by the wail of the wind outside. She stood frozen for a minute, then 5. The adrenaline was so high she couldn't feel her own heart. He'd said lock it. She ran to the door, but there was no lock on the inside. She was locked in. He was out there, starving. And Kincaid had just sent his tactical guards up when the monitors flatlined. Lena heard it through the heavy door. A wet, tearing sound. A choked-off gurgle. A heavy thud as a body hit the marble floor. She covered her mouth, her stomach churning. "Hide!" The sane part of her brain screamed at her. "Get in the bathroom, lock the door, hide!" But the doctor in her grabbed the medical trauma kit, the suture needles, the gauze. She was standing in the middle of the room, paralyzed by indecision when the penthouse door slid open again. He was standing in the entryway, framed by the dark hallway. He was soaked, his black silk shirt, his hands, his face. He was covered in blood. It wasn't a smear, he was drenched in it. His silver-white hair was matted with it. He leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving with those new, ragged breaths. The red was back in his eyes, but it wasn't a faint, dying ember. It was a blazing, sated inferno. This was the king. This was the monster. "I told you," he breathed, his voice a deep, resonant rumble, no longer the pained rasp, "to stay away." They were your men," Lena whispered, staring at the carnage in the hall just behind him. She could see a black tactical boot motionless on the floor. "They were sustenance," he corrected. He stepped into the penthouse light, and Lena saw he was still hurt. The silver was gone, purged, but there was a new wound, a dark, ragged gash in his side where one of the guards must have gotten a lucky shot in, a silver-jacketed bullet or a combat knife. His new, living body was trying to heal, but it was slow. It was human. "Sit," Lena commanded, and she was shocked her voice worked. He looked surprised by the order, but the fight was gone. The hunger was sated, but the feeling, the adrenaline, the life, the guilt, the pleasure, it was overwhelming him. He sank onto the edge of the leather sofa. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the suture kit. She was kneeling on the floor, stitching the wound of a monster who had just butchered 2 men. "This is what you woke up, Lena," he murmured, watching her. She finished the last stitch, her hands covered in his blood. It was cold, but there was a new, fragile warmth underneath it. "You're afraid of me," he stated. "Yes." She couldn't lie. "Good." He caught her hand, not the one with the needle, her other hand. His grip was iron. He turned it over, his gaze fixed on the small, healing cut on her palm. This is the poison," he whispered. "This is the cure." He lifted her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. He was watching her fear, and it was feeding something new in him. He lowered his mouth to her inner wrist. "Severin," Lena breathed, her entire body rigid. Please, don't. He wasn't listening. He was lost in the scent, in the proximity of the life that had restarted his own. The red blaze in his eyes softened, replaced by a dark, obsessive fascination. She felt his cold lips, his breath, against the delicate skin over her pulse. He opened his mouth. Lena felt the sharp, cold prick of his fangs just grazing the skin. A single, terrified tear tracked down her face. He stopped. His eyes snapped shut. A shudder ran through his entire body. He tasted her wrist, a chaste, cold press of his lips against the tiny points his fangs had made. He stopped, just millimeters before the vein. He pulled back from her wrist. The movement was sharp, violent, as if Lena's skin had burned his lips. He released her hand, shoving himself backward until his shoulders hit the wall, and he slid down it, sitting on the expensive rug, his long legs splayed out. He looked broken, human. He stared at his own hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists. The red inferno was gone from his eyes. Now they were just silver gray, wide with a dawning, soul-deep terror that mirrored her own. The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight, broken only by the wail of the 2002 city storm and his new, ragged breathing. "What you've done," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It's not just the heart." Lena stayed where she was, kneeling on the floor, the suture needle still in her hand. "What is it?" "I'm cold." She stared at him. "You were 72 degrees. You are cold." "No." He looked up, and his gaze was so raw, so vulnerable, it was more terrifying than the hunger. "I was nothing. I was a state of being. Now I feel cold. I feel the air on my skin. I feel the ache." He motioned to the sutured wound in his side. "It hurts. It all hurts." The part of him he'd sworn off, the part he'd killed centuries ago, his humanity, was back, and it was agonizing. Lena finally understood. She hadn't just healed him. She had downgraded him. She had tethered his ancient, immortal body to the fragile, painful, feeling state of a human. His heart was beating, which meant he was consuming energy, which meant he would starve. He was alive, which meant he could die. "You're my prisoner, Lena." He said it flatly, a statement of fact, "but you're also my physician. And," he looked at the healing pinpricks on her wrist, "you're my poison." "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Your silence." He pushed himself to his feet, his new body still unsteady. He was a king learning to walk again. "And your blood." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "You want to feed on me?" "No." The denial was instant, violent. "I will not become that. The hunger, I can control. I have synthetic sources. But the healing, the silver." He touched the burn on his neck, the one she'd healed. "My enemies tried to kill me with it. They will try again. Your blood is the only thing that can reverse it. You are the only antidote to the one thing that can kill me." He walked to the window, staring out at the rain-drenched city. "You are now the most valuable, most dangerous thing in my world." "So what happens?" she asked, standing up, her knees weak. "You keep me here, a human blood bag?" "I keep you here," he said, turning, his voice dropping, "so I can keep you safe." "Safe? Safe from what?" "From everyone. From the ones who put me on that table." He took a step toward her. "This feeling, this is the weakness my enemies have waited for. If they know you are the cause, they will tear you apart to get to me." He stopped, close enough that she could feel the strange, room-temperature cold radiating from his skin. "This is the covenant, Lena. You will swear to me. You will never speak of what you are, of what you can do. You will be my physician, and my physician alone. You will keep this heart of mine a secret." "And in return?" she breathed. His silver eyes were intense, devoid of all but a raw, desperate possession. "In return, I will tear down the world for you. I will not let anyone touch you." "Including you?" she asked, the words out before she could stop them. His gaze flickered. A shadow of pain or something else crossed his face. "That is the vow." Before she could answer, a soft, triple chime echoed through the penthouse. It wasn't the frantic breach alarm. It was an arrival tone. The private elevator. Severin froze. His entire body went rigid. The new vulnerable man was gone, replaced in an instant by the ancient, cold king. "Kincaid?" Lena whispered. "Kincaid wouldn't dare," Severin murmured. His eyes locked on the elevator doors. The doors slid open with a whisper. It wasn't Kincaid. It was another man. He was younger looking than Severin, with slick black hair, a cruel, beautiful mouth, and eyes as black as oil. He was dressed in a modern, impeccably tailored suit that screamed money and power. He stepped into the penthouse, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, almost bored amusement. He saw the overturned medical cart. He saw the dark, drying lake of blood on the floor by the door, where the guards had been. He saw Lena, standing frozen by the couch. And then he saw Severin, standing by the window. The man's amused smile froze. He stared. He wasn't looking at Severin's face. He was looking at his chest. "Impossible," the man whispered, his voice a sibilant hiss. "I'm busy, Marius," Severin said, his voice flat and cold. "You're breathing." Marius's black eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a sudden, rabid calculation. He looked from Severin's slowly rising and falling chest to the blood on the floor, and then finally his gaze landed on Lena. He ignored Severin completely. He looked at Lena as if she were a complex equation he had just solved. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Marius hissed, his eyes drinking her in. "Severin Vale, brought back from the brink. It is true. The old bloodline wasn't erased after all." He looked right at her. "You're the key." "You're the key!" Marius's words hung in the air, a sibilant poison. He was looking at Lena, but his words were a dagger aimed at Severin. "Marius?" Severin's voice was deathly quiet. He didn't move, but the temperature in the penthouse dropped. The new, fragile warmth of his living body was gone, snuffed out by an ancient, absolute cold. Marius's calculating smile widened. He saw the new, raw pain in Severin's posture. He saw the ragged, living breaths. And he saw Lena, the terrified human, standing beside the sutures and blood. He had found the wound. "The council will be fascinated," Marius purred. "Our king, with a heartbeat, all because of a lost little echo of Leah Moreau. How romantic, and how weak." In a movement so fast it was invisible, Severin crossed the room. He wasn't a living man. He was a force. He stood an inch from Marius, his silver-white hair stark against the dark, bloody walls of the hallway. "You will not speak her name," Severin snarled. "I don't have to." Marius didn't flinch. "They will." He gave Lena one last, lingering look, a look that promised dissection. "The key," he whispered again. He bowed, a deep, mocking gesture, and stepped back into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing Severin and Lena back into their tomb. For a full minute, Severin didn't move. He just stared at the closed steel doors. Then he turned. The agony was back in his eyes, but it was cold, sharp. It was the agony of a king who had just seen his entire fortress compromised. "He knows," Severin said, his voice flat. "We're leaving." The transition was brutal. There was no packing, no explanation. One moment, Lena was in the penthouse. The next, Kincaid was escorting her through a private, subterranean garage, the bodies of the guards already gone. An armored black car sped through the rain-soaked streets of 2002 New York, leaving the city lights behind. Severin sat beside her, silent, his body rigid, staring out the window. He was a statue of contained violence. They drove for hours, the sound of the city fading, replaced by the roar of the ocean. They arrived at a place that was not a home. It was a fortress of black steel and dark smoked glass, perched on a desolate cliff over the storm-tossed Atlantic. It was a monument to isolation, the House of Glass. They entered, and the house swallowed them. The air was sterile, recycled, and tomb-still. There was no dust. There were no photographs. Just vast, empty rooms of black marble, dark leather and glass. Everywhere, floor-to-ceiling windows showed the raging black ocean, but they were sealed, permanently. A handful of human staff, dressed in simple gray uniforms, materialized from the shadows. They moved with a silent, practiced terror. They did not make eye contact with Severin. They barely looked at Lena. They bowed. They took her single medical kit. They scurried. They were ghosts, terrified of their master. "She will be housed in the East Wing," Severin commanded the empty air. She is to have whatever she requires. She is not to leave that wing. He turned and disappeared down a dark corridor, his new living footfalls swallowed by the oppressive silence. Lena was alone, a prisoner in a house that felt like an open casket coffin. A pale, trembling housekeeper showed Lena to her room. It was beautiful, opulent, and dead. One entire wall was a sheet of glass looking out at the dawn, which was beginning to stain the dark sky a sick, bruised purple. The storm had passed. The silence was absolute. Lena felt the walls closing in. The air was too thick, too still. She needed air. She needed to breathe something that wasn't this sealed, sterile environment. She went to the window. The glass was an inch thick, cold as ice, but she saw it. A small, recessed latch, a manual override. Her fingers closed around the cold steel handle. I wouldn't do that. She spun, her heart leaping into her throat. Severin was there, standing in the doorway, a shadow against the dim hall light. I need air, she said, her voice shaking. It's just the sunrise. It is not just the sunrise. He crossed the room, his voice no longer the king's command, but sharp with a sudden, genuine terror that chilled her to the bone. He slammed his hand against the glass, inches from her face, covering the latch. His body was rigid, his face pale and strained in the pre-dawn light. You think I fear fire? He hissed, his face close to hers. Fire is a mercy. The sun, the direct light. It's not a burn, it's a sickness. It's a plague that boils the mind. It starts as a headache, then the vision blurs, and then the nerves ignite. It's a seizure that never ends. It is neural collapse. It is madness and agony before the body finally stops. He looked at her, his silver eyes dark with the horrifying personal memory of it. I would rather walk into a furnace than feel one ray of that dawn. The windows are sealed for a reason. He pulled his hand back, checking the latch was secure. He left her standing there, her hand still raised, her breath fogging the cold, sealed glass. He was gone. Lena was alone again, the silence of the vast, empty house pressing in. She was a prisoner, but an untended one. She had to move. She crept out of her room and into the empty, echoing halls. Room after empty room, furnished with cold, minimalist precision. This was not a home. It was a showroom. She found a hallway in the oldest part of the house, a wing made of the original cliffstone, not glass. A single, heavy wooden door stood at the end. It was unlocked. She pushed it open. It was an artist's studio. Dust motes danced in the light of a single, heavily filtered skylight. Dozens of canvases, all covered in white dust cloths, stood like a silent congregation. She pulled the sheet off the nearest one. It was a portrait. A woman with dark hair and familiar, wide eyes, wearing a dress Lena recognized from a history book, 19th century. She pulled another sheet. The same woman, her hair different, wearing a 1950s-style swing dress, laughing. Another, the same woman, in the sharp-shouldered power suit of the 1980s. Another, dozens of them. The face was always the same. The last one was small, sitting on an easel, unfinished. The paint was still tacky. It was her, asleep, her head tilted, in the penthouse. A moment he must have captured just days ago. Lena backed away, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She bumped into a canvas behind her, knocking it to the floor. She bent to pick it up. It was the oldest one. The frame was heavy, ornate. The woman was in a Regency-era gown, her hair piled in dark curls. The face, it was identical to her own. Her eyes fell to the small brass plaque on the frame. Lea Moreau, 1815. Her ancestor. Marius had said the name, Lea Moreau. But that wasn't the shock. Lena looked from the 1815 painting to the 1950s painting to the 1980s painting. She looked at the new, unfinished one of herself. In every single painting, the face was hers. But in every single one of them, the woman in the portrait was visibly, undeniably younger. The dust motes in the studio seemed to freeze. Lena's hand, still tracing the brass plaque, Lea Moreau, 1815, went numb. It wasn't just the portraits. It wasn't just the identical face, her face, staring back at her from 2 centuries ago. It was the age. Leah was in her 20s. The woman from the 1950s was a teenager. The woman from the 80s, a child. It was a bloodline, painted in reverse. A family tree contracting toward a single point, toward her. A deep, grinding groan vibrated through the stone floor, shaking the dust from the canvases. It wasn't the house elevator. This was a sound of immense, ancient machinery coming from far beneath the cliff. The oppressive silence of the house was gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant pressure, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She was drawn to it. She ran from the studio, her footsteps echoing in the empty, glass-walled halls. She found Severin in the main atrium. He was no longer the pained, wounded man in a silk shirt. He was the king. He was dressed in a severe, tailored black coat that fell to his knees, his silver-white hair stark, his posture rigid. He was standing at the center of the vast marble floor, facing a set of massive, floor-to-ceiling bronze doors she had assumed were part of the architecture. They were sliding open, revealing an elevator car large enough to hold a vehicle. It was empty. Severin's gaze was fixed on the open elevator. He was perfectly, unnaturally still. "Lena," he said, his voice a low command, not looking at her. "Go to your room, now." But she was frozen. The air was turning arctic. A wisp of vapor misted from her lips. 3 figures emerged from the elevator. They were not like Severin. They were not like Marius. They were ancient kin. They looked like statues carved from dry ice and old marble. One was a woman, her face a mask of serene, cruel beauty, her hair a cascade of white. The other 2 were men, indistinguishable, their faces so old they were beyond expression. They wore simple dark robes that looked woven from shadow. Their stillness was absolute. When they moved, they didn't walk, they glided. Marius was with them, a step behind, his black eyes glittering with triumph. The central figure, the woman, glided to a stop 10 feet from Severin. Her eyes, a pale milky blue, did not even flicker in his direction. They settled, cold and possessive, on Lena. "The king is compromised," the woman's voice whispered. It was the sound of dry leaves skittering over ice. "The human experiment is over. Surrender the Moreau." Severin did not move. "She is my physician, elder. She is a plague," Marius hissed, stepping forward. "I saw it. He breathes, elder. His heart beats. The silver that should have killed him. She reversed it. She is an abomination, a reversal of the serum's great gift." The elder's milky blue eyes narrowed on Lena. "Our kind was lifted above the weakness of the flesh. We are control. We are logic. We are immortal. That thing," she pointed a marble white finger at Lena, "reintroduces the chaos, the pain, the mortality. It is a sickness that will be our end. The council demands her, Severin. We will dissect her. We will learn how to eradicate the bloodline, and then we will cleanse your new, beating heart." Lena watched, her body numb with a terror so profound she couldn't even scream. This was it. They weren't just going to kill her. They were going to study her. This was the law, the cold, sterile, medicalized law of their species. And Severin, their king, was its greatest adherent. Severin was silent, his back to Lena, facing the council. He was being judged by the very laws he had upheld for 2 centuries. He had to choose his ancient cold logic or the new, agonizing, human chaos that was Lena. The elder took a step. "Do not make this a war, my king." Severin slowly turned his head. He looked at Lena, his silver-gray eyes unreadable, black with an ancient, impossible conflict. Then he turned back to the council. "No." The word was quiet, but it shattered the silence. The elder's serene face cracked. "You would defy the council for a pet?" "She is not a pet." "Then she is a weakness," the elder shrieked, her voice suddenly human and full of fear. "You would doom us all for a feeling?" Severin's response was not a word. It was an action. In a blur of motion that ripped the air, he crossed the hall. He grabbed Lena, his iron-cold grip bruising her arm, and yanked her against his chest. She stumbled, crying out, her face slamming into his cold, hard coat. The council members hissed, their forms blurring, fangs descending. "Stand down," Severin roared, the sound of a true ancient predator. In front of them all, in a public, brutal declaration of war, he tilted her head back. Lena stared, terrified, into his silver-gray eyes, and for the first time, she saw it. Not logic, not control, obsession. He buried his face in her neck. It was not a kiss. It was not a feed. It was a brand, a claim, a violent political act. Lena screamed as his fangs, needle-sharp and ice-cold, pierced the skin above her pulse. It wasn't just pain. It was a jolt, an agonizing electric slam as his cold, dead immortality flooded her veins, and her warm living blood flooded his. The bond. "She is not an experiment," Severin snarled, his voice muffled against her skin, his fangs still in her. "She is mine. She is under royal protection." The bond was a physical shock. It was not a one-way street. As his fangs sank into her, a jolt of ice and ancient power flooded Lena's system, making her knees buckle. But she felt him gasp against her skin. He wasn't just drinking. He was feeling. He felt her terror, her adrenaline, the frantic, hot rush of her 98.6-degree blood. He was feeling life, undiluted, and it was a drug. The ancient kin recoiled, their faces contorted in a shared mask of disgust and horror. This was not a feed. This was a bonding, a public, sacramental act of defiance, an ancient law Severin had just invoked to protect a human. "You have bonded with a mortal?" the elder whispered, her voice cracking. "You tie yourself to a dying thing? You have damned us, Severin. You have damned yourself. Get out." Severin's voice was a low, guttural growl, his fangs still at Lena's throat. He was shaking, not with weakness, but with a new, terrifying, living rage. Marius stared, his black eyes wide, not with fear, but with the rabid, ecstatic look of a zealot who had just seen his god bleed. He knew, in that moment, that Severin was truly broken. He bowed, a low, sweeping, triumphant gesture. The council turned, a silent flow of shadows, and glided back into the bronze elevator. The doors boomed shut, a sound of finality, a declaration of war. Severin did not release her. The second the doors sealed, he ripped his mouth from her neck, a wet, tearing sound that made her cry out. He was breathing, ragged, desperate gasps. His silver-gray eyes were no longer cold. They were on fire, blazing with the red of her blood, with hunger, and with something else. Possession. "Mine," he snarled, and it wasn't a word. It was a verdict. He lifted her, one arm sweeping under her legs, the other supporting her back, and carried her from the atrium. His movements were no longer the careful, controlled steps of an ancient being. They were the desperate, living strides of a man. He didn't take her to her room. He took her to his. It was a vast, cold chamber of glass and stone, dominated by a massive, stark bed. He didn't put her down. He fell onto the bed with her, his body a dead weight of cold, hard muscle, caging her. This was the reckoning, the passion. The bond was screaming through both of them. Lena could feel him. She felt the sudden, agonizing rush of her blood hitting his dead, cold system. She felt his new heart, thump, thump, slamming against his ribs, trying to process the living warmth. It was agony. It was ecstasy. He buried his face in her hair, his entire body shuddering. "It hurts," he whispered, his voice broken. "Lena, it hurts." He wasn't talking about the council. He was talking about feeling. The guilt, the fear, the rage, the desire. It was a sensory overload he hadn't experienced in 200 years. You're cold," she whispered, her hands pressed against his chest. He captured her hands, pinning them above her head. "And you are warm," he hissed, his mouth crashing down on hers. It was not a kiss. It was a collision. It was brutal, clumsy, and desperate. His lips were ice, but his mouth was hot with her own blood. It was a kiss of plunder, of a starving man devouring his first meal. It was violent, a desperate, angry attempt to consume the one thing that made him feel. He was terrified of her, and he was terrified of losing her, and the two emotions had become a single, violent obsession. And then, in the middle of the violence, it broke. He tore his mouth from hers, a sob shaking his frame. He collapsed against her, his face buried in the curve of her neck, not in hunger, but in surrender. The tenderness was real. "They'll kill you," he whispered, his voice raw. "To get to me, they'll tear you apart. And you'll let them?" she breathed, her fear finally giving way to a strange, defiant anger. "Never." He raised his head, his silver eyes clear, the red gone, replaced by a pure, terrifying clarity. "I will burn this world to ash before I let them touch you." He didn't move for hours. He simply held her, his new heart beating a slow, steady, living rhythm against hers. It was almost dawn when he finally fell into the profound, death-like torpor that was his version of sleep. His grip on her loosened. Lena slid out from under his arm. Her neck was throbbing, her body bruised, her mind a wreck. She was bonded to him. She could feel him, a cold, silent presence in the back of her mind, even in his sleep. She fled the room. She needed to understand. She found herself back in the dusty studio, the air thick with the smell of old paint. Lea Moreau, 1815. "How?" she whispered to the portrait that wore her face. "How are you connected to this?" She ran her fingers along the heavy, ornate frame of the 1815 painting. Her nail caught on a small, hidden catch. A click. A section of the frame's carved molding sprang open, revealing a hollow space inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a book, a small, leather-bound physician's ledger, its pages brown with age. The spine was embossed with a single name, Dr. L. Moreau. Lena's hands shook as she opened it. The 19th century script was precise, scientific. It was not a diary. It was a logbook of a medical experiment. She read entries on blood preservation, on cellular decay, on a single, wealthy, anonymous patient dying of a wasting disease. She saw formulas, chemical compounds, and notes on trial and error dosages. Then she saw it. The final entry, dated 1815. Trial 4. The serum is a success. The wasting is reversed. The tissue regenerates. But the cost, God help us. The hunger is insatiable. The heart, it stops. It creates an immortal, perfect, cold machine. I have cured death, and in doing so, I have created. The word was smudged, illegible, but the formula was not. It was a complex, elegant string of chemical notations that Lena, a 21st century hematology researcher, understood perfectly. This wasn't a journal. It was a patent. The serum that created vampires was her ancestors' work. I have created. The words from her ancestors' journal echoed in Lena's head. She was standing in the dusty studio, her fingers tracing the 19th century script, a living ghost staring at the work of another. She was the descendant of the woman who had created this plague. She was the cure. A heavy metallic thunk echoed through the stone. The single, filtered skylight snapped shut, plunging the studio into absolute darkness. Then, silence. The house, a fortress of automated, silent technology, had just died. The air recycling system, the faint electrical hum, the soft emergency lights in the hall, all gone. The house of glass was now a black, airless tomb. Lena's breath caught. She stumbled out of the studio, her hands out in the oppressive dark. The pre-dawn light, that sick, bruised purple she'd seen earlier, was the only illumination. It filtered through the massive sealed windows, casting long geometric shadows across the black marble floors. The silence was wrong. It was the silence of a citywide blackout. In the main atrium, a single, battery-powered television, left on by the terrified staff, crackled to life. It was a local 2002 news broadcast, the image grainy and panicked. "Repeat, a coordinated attack," a reporter was shouting over the sound of sirens. "Riots have erupted at the Vale Biotech Tower in Manhattan. Sources are calling it a violent, hostile takeover. The entire city grid is down." The screen flashed to a live, shaky helicopter shot of the Vale. The 19th century hotel was on fire, its Gothic spires black against the burning sky. Marius. It was a coup. "Lena," Severin's voice. He was there, at the top of the grand staircase, a shadow against the dying light. The attack, the sudden, violent surge of her terror through the bond, had ripped him from his sleep. He was in his dark trousers and silk shirt, his silver-white hair a mess. He looked not like a king, but like a man who had woken to find his house on fire. "They're here," she whispered, pointing to the window. On the cliffs outside, figures were rappelling down from the darkness. They weren't the ancient, slow-moving elders. They were lesser kin, a tactical team dressed in black armor, their faces obscured by gas masks. They carried weapons that glinted, even in the dim light. "Silver, he's not just taking the company," Severin said, his voice a low, living growl. "He's purging the bloodline. He's here for you." The sound of an industrial drill screamed against the reinforced glass. Severin was at her side in a blur. He grabbed her arm, his grip the same iron hold from the bonding, and pulled her toward the stone corridor. "He will not have you," he snarled. They were too late. The massive glass pane of the atrium window didn't shatter. It imploded, collapsing inward in a waterfall of pulverized, glittering dust. Silver gas grenades rolled across the floor, hissing. "Cover your mouth," Lena yelled, pulling her shirt over her face. "It's not for you," Severin choked out. The gas hit him and he roared. It wasn't a poison. It was an acid. The silver-laced air sizzled against his new, living skin, his new, breathing lungs. He staggered, clutching his chest. A raw, human sound of agony ripped from his throat. The tactical vampires swarmed in, their movements fast and precise. They saw their king, on his knees, and their only loyalty was to the new regime. Severin was a god, but he was a wounded god. He launched himself at them, a whirlwind of white-hot living fury. He was no longer the cold, precise duelist. He was a brawler, a cornered animal, fueled by a rage so human it was terrifying. He tore them apart, but for every one he felled, two more took its place, firing silver-jacketed rocks that ripped into his living flesh. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds.
"Severin!" Lena screamed.
"Run!" he roared, throwing a vampire through a marble column. She didn't. She grabbed a heavy, bronze statue from a pedestal and smashed it into the back of a kin who was leveling a weapon at Severin's head. The vampire turned, his black eyes flat, and slapped her. The force sent her flying, her head cracking against the stone floor. Her vision exploded in a burst of white static. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw a figure step through the broken window, untouched by the gas, immaculate in a black suit. Marius. He walked past the fight, past Severin, who was pinned down by 3 attackers, and calmly stopped in front of Lena. He crouched, brushing the hair from her face. "He actually bleeds for you," Marius mused, his voice filled with a scientist's curiosity. "The key, the cure, the poison. You've ruined the most perfect creature in existence." "Go to hell," Lena spat, her vision swimming. "We're already there, my dear," he smiled. "And I am the new king." He grabbed her, his grip effortless, and slung her over his shoulder. "Lena!" Severin's roar was a sound of pure, elemental loss. He threw the vampires off him, his body a map of smoking, silver-cauterized wounds, and lunged. But Marius was already at the window. He stepped out onto the cliff, where a black, unmarked helicopter waited, its rotors whipping the air. Lena, her world spinning upside down, saw Severin, framed in the broken window of his burning house, his empire in ruins. He was too late. Marius threw her into the helicopter and jumped in after her. "Your empire is mine, old man." Marius's voice crackled over the helicopter's speaker, projecting to the cliff. "But she is the key to my new one. A world where our kind can be healed. A world where I can sell her blood to the highest bidder." The helicopter lifted, its searchlight blinding Severin. He stood there, wounded, defeated, watching the only thing he cared about disappear into the night. The last of his tactical vampires, seeing their new master escape, retreated. Severin sank to one knee, his living heart slamming against his ribs, a drum of pure, impotent rage. A moment later, a side door opened. Mr. Kincaid, his face ashen, ran to Severin's side, holding a satellite phone. "Sir, we're dark. The Vale Tower is lost. The Council has seized the lower labs. Marius has the patents. He's locked us out of the blood reserves." Severin stared at the red light of the helicopter, disappearing over the black, storm-tossed ocean. He took the phone. His hand was shaking, not from pain. "Kincaid," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Initiate scorched earth. Protocol 0. Kincaid's eyes went wide with horror. "Sir, you can't. That's not a protocol. It's a suicide pact. It will liquidate everything. It will detonate the primary synthesis fats under the hotel. It will erase the patent servers. It will burn your entire empire, everything you built. Severin looked at the dot of light in the sky. Yes, he was burning his empire to get to her. The air was thick with the smell of burning chemicals and ozone. Lena was strapped to a cold steel gurney, the same kind Severin had been on, but this one was in the shell of the Vale's sub-basement lab. The scorched earth protocol had worked. The hotel above them was a roaring inferno, and the lab was tearing itself apart. Emergency lights flashed red, painting the concrete-dusted room in strokes of panic. Marius was calm. He was drawing her blood, filling rack after rack of sterile vials, his movements precise, almost bored, as the world ended around him. "He's a fool," Marius said, not looking at her as he snapped a full vial into a refrigerated case. "He's burning his own kingdom, all for this." He tapped the vial of her blood, this volatile, imperfect, human element. "He's forgotten that what we are is better." "He's coming for you," Lena choked out, the words thick with smoke and fear. "He's already here." Marius smiled, a cold, cruel pulling of his lips. "And he's dying." A seismic boom shook the foundation. Not an explosion. It was the sound of the main containment door, 3 tons of reinforced steel, being torn from its hinges. Severin stood in the ruined doorway, framed by fire and smoke. He was no longer a king. He was a reckoning. His black coat was shredded, his silver-white hair matted with blood and soot. He was covered in silver-laced wounds, bullet holes, burns, and deep gashes, all weeping dark, living blood. His heart was pumping, and it was pumping his life out onto the floor. But his eyes were not the cold, dead silver of a vampire. They were the blazing, red-hot inferno of a living man's rage, and they were locked on Marius. "You," Severin snarled, "will not touch her." "You're already dead," Marius sneered, tossing the blood-filled syringe. "You're just too human to know it." The fight was not a duel. It was a brawl. A brutal, desperate clash between the old and the new. Marius was fast, cold, and precise, his movements the effortless grace of the immortal. But Severin was living. He was fury. He was pain. He fought with a desperate, human strength, fueled by adrenaline and a heart that was slamming against his ribs. Marius, with his cold logic, couldn't comprehend the raw, chaotic power of Severin's new, human feeling. Severin, with a roar, tackled Marius, slamming him through a sparking console. But Marius was uninjured. He was cold. Severin was bleeding out. Marius retrieved a shard of rebar from the concrete debris, its tip gleaming with the silver gas from the ruptured pipes. "You feel, Severin?" he hissed. "You bleed? Then die like the animal you've become." He lunged. Severin, in his new, slow, mortal body, tried to dodge. He was too late. Marius drove the silver-laced rebar straight through Severin's side, impaling him, pinning him to the floor. "No!" Lena screamed, fighting the restraints. Severin gasped, a wet, choking sound. His body arched, and the red light in his eyes flickered, dimmed. The silver was in his living bloodstream. It was a poison his new body couldn't fight. Marius smiled, triumphant. He turned to Lena. "Now, where were we?" He never made it. Severin, in a final, agonizing human act, grabbed the rebar that was pinning him and pulled, ripping it free of the floor. With a final, guttural roar, he lunged, not at Marius, but at the weakened concrete wall behind him, where the fire raged brightest. He tackled Marius, and the two of them, the old king and the new, plunged through the wall and into the heart of the inferno below. The floor collapsed, swallowing Marius in fire. Severin just hung there. He had caught himself on the broken edge of the floor, his legs dangling over the fire, the silver rebar still buried in his gut. He was dying. Lena ripped the straps from the gurney, her nails tearing, and scrambled over the debris to him. She grabbed his hands. They were cold. The new, fragile warmth was gone. His heart, she could feel it, was stuttering, a faint, weak thump, thump. "Severin!" She pulled, but he was a dead weight. "Hold on!" He looked at her. His eyes were no longer red. They were just silver gray, filmed over with pain, the life draining out of them. "Too late, Lena," he whispered. his grip weakening. It's cold. He was dying. The silver was stopping his new heart. "No!" Lena's voice was a snarl. "No, you don't! You don't get to die. You don't get to leave." She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a prisoner. She was the cure. She was the poison. He was too weak to fight, too weak to even resist. She yanked him up, his body half slumped against the broken floor. She grabbed his head, his cold face between her hands, and pulled his mouth to her own neck. "Drink!" she commanded, her voice breaking. He was barely conscious. His lips were slack. "I said drink!" she screamed, raw, desperate. She jammed her own wrist against his mouth, against his fangs. "You started this. You feel this. You don't get to check out. Live, damn you!" His body was inert, but at the scent, the raw, hot proximity of her blood, his mouth spasmed, a reflex. His fangs, weak, grazed her skin. It was enough. Her blood, the key, the cure, flowed. His eyes snapped open. They were silver gray. They were wide with shock. And then the silver vanished. The gray dissolved. His eyes, for one agonizing, impossible second, were blue. A clear, bright, terrified human blue. His heart, which had been failing, suddenly slammed against his ribs. A frantic, rabbit-fast human tachycardia. He gasped, a true, real human breath, a breath of pure, agonizing life. He was human, for a heartbeat. Then the building gave way. A secondary explosion from the vats below ripped the floor apart. The world erupted in a blinding flash of white light, smoke, and ash. The force threw Lena backward, into blackness. When she woke, seconds later, the smoke was clearing. The fire was raging below. The ledge where he had been was empty. He was gone, vanished into the smoke. Weeks passed. The city moved on. The skyline was scarred by a new wound. The Vale Hotel was a burned-out skeletal husk, a new tragic landmark for tourists to photograph. The official story was a gas main explosion, a freak accident, a footnote in the city's long, violent history. Vale Biotech was gone, dissolved in a day. The stock, VBTX, was delisted. The patents were absorbed by a dozen shell corporations. The media ran stories on its reclusive, eccentric founder, Severin Vale, but there were no photographs, no history, no records. It was a corporate ghost story. Lena Arden was a ghost, too. She was no longer a doctor, no longer a researcher. She was a woman with a singular, obsessive purpose. She lived in a cheap, pay-by-the-week motel in the shadow of the Queensboro Bridge. The cash she'd had in her pockets at the mansion, her only currency. She spent her days watching the ruin. She spent her nights investigating. Tonight, she was going in. She cut through a weak link in the chain-link fence, the metal groaning. The air inside the demolition site was thick with the smell of wet ash, rot, and the 19th century stone of the old hotel. It was a tomb. She had a duffel bag, a hard hat, and a high-powered flashlight. She knew the layout. She bypassed the collapsed marble lobby and found the service entrance that led to the sub-basements. The elevator was a void. Its cable snapped, but the emergency stairwell was there, a spiral of twisted, melted steel. She descended, climbing over fallen concrete, deeper into the black. The lab was a graveyard. Her flashlight beam cut through the inches of gray, settled ash. The room where she had first seen him, where the tactical team had burst in, was a cavern of debris. The equipment was melted slag. He was gone. She had told the police. She'd sat in a precinct, a Jane Doe in shock, and told a disbelieving detective about a man named Severin Vale, about an underground lab. They had run her name, Dr. Lena Arden, missing for weeks, presumed dead in the Vale fire. She was a ghost with a story no one believed. She found the hallway to the secondary lab, the one Marius had used. The gurney she'd been strapped to was still there, overturned, half buried in rubble. She had come for proof, a file, a hard drive, a single piece of evidence that he was real, that any of it was real. But Marius and the council had been thorough, and Severin's scorched earth protocol had been absolute. She found the server room. The mainframe was a melted, blackened coffin of plastic and silicon. The hard drives were puddles of metallic sludge. He was erased, wiped from history, from memory, from the world. Lena sank to her knees, the flashlight beam pointing at the floor. The ash, thick and soft as snow, muffled the sound of her sob. It was over. He was gone. He had died human. He had died saving her. And the world he had built, had swallowed his memory whole. She was the only person left alive who even knew his name. Her grief was a hollow, aching cold. The bond, it was silent. The space in her mind where his cold, ancient presence had been was just empty, a scar. She dropped her flashlight. It rolled, the beam cutting a frantic circle through the darkness, before settling on a pile of debris. It was the ICU cart from the penthouse. It must have fallen through the 10 stories of the collapsed building, a miracle of physics, and landed here, in the sub-basement. It was crushed, mangled, but the monitor, the heavy, ruggedized diagnostic screen, was still attached. It was dark, its screen cracked. Lena stared at it. That monitor had read flatline when his heart had first beat. She picked up a piece of rebar, her movements numb, and slammed the butt of it against the monitor's casing. Not in hope, in rage, a furious, grieving tantrum against the inanimate object. "You lied," she whispered, hitting it again. A single green LED flickered on. Lena froze. The light stayed on. A faint, high-pitched whine came from the machine. A backup battery. A fail-safe. It was dying, but it was on. The cracked screen flickered, a blur of static. Then, a single line of text. Reestablishing biotelemetry link. "No," she breathed. "It's impossible. The hardware is destroyed. Link established." A line appeared. A single, jagged, moving line. It wasn't a flat line. It wasn't the slow 10-second thump of his immortal heart. It was a rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. It was frantic. A panicked tachycardia. 140 beats per minute. 150. Then it settled. 120. 90. 80. It settled into a perfect, steady, rhythmic wave. 72 beats per minute. Lena's hand, covered in ash and grime, pressed against the cracked glass, as if she could touch the man on the other side. It was a heartbeat on an old monitor. Steady, human. 72 beats per minute. The number was a brand on Lena's mind. It was the only thing that was real. She had left the monitor in the ruins, its green line a beacon in the ash-filled tomb. That was a week ago. Now she was just waiting. The motel room in Queens was a cage, the walls thin. The city's 2002 soundtrack of sirens and traffic a constant, grinding noise. The hope was worse than the grief. Grief had been an ending. Hope was a razor wire, stretched tight, vibrating with a tension that never let her sleep. He was alive. He was human. But he was gone. A knock. It wasn't the timid knock of the motel manager. It was a sharp, precise thud, thud, thud. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked through the peephole. A man in a black, impossibly crisp courier uniform, holding a small, brown paper-wrapped package. He had no bike, no truck. He was just there. She opened the door, the chain still on. "Lena Arden?" he asked. His voice was flat. She nodded, mute. He slid the small package through the gap. It was light. "Who is it from?" she whispered, her hand shaking. "There is no return address." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent in the grimy hall. She locked the door, her pulse frantic. The package was simple, tied with string, no stamps, no postmark. It was hand-delivered. Her fingers tore at the string. Inside the paper was a small wooden box, not a new polished box, an old one, dark wood, smelling faintly of smoke and something metallic. The same scent of ozone and copper from the first night. There was no note, just a single piece of heavy cream-colored paper, folded once and sealed, not with wax. It was sealed with a single, dark, dried drop of blood. She broke the seal with her thumbnail, the dried flake of blood crumbling. Her heart was a painful, living thing, just like his. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was not the elegant, sharp script of a 19th century king. It was the unsteady, flawed, human hand of someone learning to write again. There were only 2 lines. "You touched what I swore I'd never love again, and now it lives." Lena's knees gave out. She sank to the cheap motel carpet, the letter clutched in her hand. It wasn't just his heart. It wasn't just his body. His humanity, his capacity to feel, his soul. The love he had murdered 2 centuries ago. It lives. He was human. He was alive. And he remembered her. The motel room was suffocating. She had to move. She ran, the letter clutched in her hand. She ran not from anything, but to something. to the air, to the world he was now a part of. She found herself on the pier at Gantry Plaza, the skeletal remains of the Vale just a dark scar on the Manhattan skyline across the water. The sky was that same bruised, pre-dawn purple, the color of neural collapse, the color of madness. But Lena wasn't afraid. She walked to the very end of the rotting wooden pier, the cold October wind whipping her hair. The sun began to break over the city, a sliver of brilliant, agonizing white. The first ray of direct sunlight hit the pier, scalding the night away. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She tilted her head back and let the warmth, the real, living warmth, hit her face. It was not a sickness. It was not a plague. It was just light. She was human. She was alive. The bond in her mind was still there, no longer a cold, ancient presence, but a faint, warm scar, an echo. She looked down. The rising sun cast her shadow long and sharp on the weathered wood of the pier. It was her shadow, but it wasn't alone. Her shadow was split in two.
I walked through the fire. I stayed undone. Your shadow touched mine. Now we are one. Light through the ashes. Feel it begin. It lies. It lives again.